My name is Rebecca Fricka, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Amherst. First of all, thank you for coming tonight. I don't know about you, but it isn't fall until the League has had its opening meeting, so we can declare it fall. Before I introduce John Bonifaz, our evening speaker, I would like to make a few announcements. On October 16th, our Follow the Money interest group will present Democracy in the Balance, which will showcase 2 years of work examining campaign finance, and they will provide a historical perspective on money, power, and our elections. The committee encourages even those familiar with the material, such as all of you, to attend, as it will be a preview to the program which they will be launching across the valley in the months to come. The event will run from 12 to 1:30 at the South Amherst Munson Library. On November 1st, we have Bill Newman, director of the Western Massachusetts ACLU. He will be presenting a talk which he calls Assault on Democracy, Voter Suppression in America, 2012. This will be held at the Jones Library. There will be refreshments at 6:30 and the program will begin at 7. On November 8th, the town meeting warrant review will be held from 7 to 9:30 in the town room at the town hall. The warrant for the fall town meeting will be signed on October 22nd, and Martha Hanner is asking for volunteers to review the warrant articles with her. What we need to do is identify any warrant articles that the League can support. So please contact Martha Hanner or myself if you are interested. And in December, you can look forward to the Energy Committee's consensus meetings. At that time, our membership will work to come up with position statements about alternative energy policies that we would like to lobby for. So this year, we have 3 committees working on very important local and national topics. As you may have seen in the bulletin, the Local Environmental Action Group is working with the Town of Amherst Recycling Committee to ban styrofoam. And they're going to be going from restaurant to restaurant to do some interviews and try and, I think, convince them that there are alternatives. They will also be having a warrant article up in the spring at the town meeting.
It's for the fall.
Oh, it's for the fall.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So it's coming up soon. So they've been doing a lot of very important work. We have members working on single-payer health care. And this group has been working together for years, but they're always open to new people with a passion. And even though the Energy Committee is wrapping up their study, the committee would welcome new members. After we reach some consensus, we will then be able to use our position to influence policy and programs at the local, state, and national level. Finally, the interest committee we call Follow the Money is always looking for new people to study the influence of money in politics and ways to reform campaign finance. Study committees are a vital part of the League process, and it is because of our careful, balanced consensus statements that we have a program from which we can lobby on a wide range of issues. If you would like to join any of these committees, please sign the committee sheets at the back. They're on the table back there. Now for our program this evening. Campaign finance has been a major focus of the League since the 1970s. Our current position on the issue of campaign finance calls for full disclosure of campaign contributions and a fair, open, accessible electoral process. As many of you know, this past June, members of several Massachusetts leagues returned from the League of Women Voters U.S. convention exhausted and greatly satisfied. As many of you know, this past June, they did return just once. This group included John Bonifaz, who was a member of the Amherst League, and they strategically ushered a resolution on campaign finance reform through the complexities of the convention process. Our resolution urged the League of Women Voters U.S. Board to advocate strongly for all appropriate, duly considered measures which may include but are not limited to a constitutional amendment. This passed almost unanimously by the General Assembly. However, at this time, the League of Women Voters U.S. does not have a position advocating for a constitutional amendment. This being said, and this is important, our league believes that each of us needs to think about our individual response to this question, which will be on the November ballot in our district. And in order to help us organize our thoughts, we have invited John Bonifaz to speak to us tonight. John Bonifaz is the co-founder and executive director of Free Speech for People, a national campaign launched on January 20th, 2010, the day of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. For the past 2.5 years, John has worked in this state and nationally for a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to overturn the ruling and to make clear that corporations are not people with constitutional rights. John will discuss the serious and direct threat to American democracy presented by the Citizens United ruling, as it unleashes a torrent of corporate money into our political process, and how we, as a people, can fight back to reclaim our democracy. John is a prominent constitutional attorney and democracy advocate. He was a 1992 cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School and a 1999 recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming John Bonifaz.
Thank you very much for a generous introduction. I'm honored to be here with all of you and on this night when there's an important debate happening at this hour. It's kind of you to come out and have this discussion on this critical question of our time. I'm sure we'll all be able to catch the taped version of that debate. I also want to very much thank the League of Women Voters of Amherst for its leadership, along with the League of Concord Carlisle and the League of Sudbury, in going to the National Convention. I was honored to participate in it as a delegate for the League from Amherst, in pressing for the passage of the resolution that Rebecca referenced. This is an important step forward, not only for the movement as a whole, but for the League of Women Voters. It's only appropriate that an organization that emerged from the fight for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution to guarantee women the right to vote be in the lead on the basic question today for a 28th Amendment to the Constitution to reclaim our democracy. And while we haven't gotten fully there yet, as Rebecca highlighted from the National League statement, as many of you may know, because of that convention vote, the Massachusetts League voted to endorse the resolution that was then pending before the Massachusetts legislature and helped to get it over the finish line. And Massachusetts is now one of 8 states calling on Congress to pass and send to the states for ratification of the 28th Amendment. So I want to give a shout out to Alice Swift, Becky Shannon, who's here, Jackie Wolf, and all the others from the leagues of Amherst, Concord, Carlisle, and Sudbury for their leadership on this critical question, and to Rebecca Fricka for her leadership of this important chapter. I also just want to do a personal shout out to an American treasure and heroine, Frances Crowe, who's come across the board. I had the honor as a recent graduate from college to work with Frances some years ago, many years ago, in a fight to stop U.S. Army-funded germ warfare research, primarily research around an anthrax weapon, and it was an honor to work with her and to be a friend of hers for so long. This moment that we have in our history is a critical moment. We're at a crossroads for America. The question really before the nation is whether it's we the people or we the corporations that shall govern in America. And the Citizens United ruling is really the ruling that has awakened the public to this critical question. We certainly had a problem with unlimited campaign spending, money in politics prior to Citizens United. But as we know, this ruling is now a direct and serious threat to the integrity of our elections and to our democracy. What I'd like to do tonight is talk about how we got to this moment where we have this ruling now sweeping away a century of precedent barring corporate money in elections, and what has transpired since the ruling was issued in January of 2010 in this growing grassroots movement to reclaim our democracy. As many of you know, Citizens United emerged as a case brought by an organization called Citizens United, a nonprofit corporation based out of Virginia, conservative advocacy group, and it had created a film called Hillary the Movie, which was designed to go after then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton in the 2008 presidential election, in the primary election cycle. And the idea in creating this movie and the advertising that would go along with the movie was to challenge particular provisions of the McCain-Feingold law, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which had been passed overwhelmingly by Congress and bipartisan nature in 2002. And the provisions they wanted to test were provisions that barred corporate and union expenditures 60 days prior to any 60 days prior to any general election, 30 days prior to any primary election. And so they created this movie and they created the advertising effectively to challenge the constitutionality of those provisions. That was their goal. That's what they set out to do. And they had their argument before the U.S. Supreme Court with that case in the spring of 2009. And then the justices did something extraordinarily rare that we don't often see, which is in July of 2009, instead of deciding the case at the end of their term and issuing the ruling, they issued a notice for re-argument in September of 2009, a special sitting of the court, in which they would pose new questions to the litigants and to all the parties involved that had not been presented before in the case. Not presented by the Citizens United group, not presented by any of the parties, not debated or presented at the trial court in any kind of factual record. And these two questions were essentially whether to throw out prior precedent that had upheld the McCain-Feingold law in 2003, just a year after the legislation was passed by Congress, and also whether to throw out a precedent going back to 1990, a case known as Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, which had barred corporate money in state elections out of Michigan, and which had reinforced the precedent that we've had for a century, barring corporate money in elections. So essentially, these 5 justices, because it wasn't a unanimous court that did this, transformed this case from one that was really a technical one around these constitutional questions around the provisions to this sweeping set of questions as to whether all this precedent would be overturned. And many of us watching this case recognize that the court may be preparing to go over the cliff. But this was a very scary moment. And there were many amici briefs that got filed, some 40 amici briefs that were filed. One of them happened to be by an former assistant attorney general for Massachusetts, Jeff Clements, who wrote a brief that articulated why corporations should not be treated as people under the Constitution. He had seen from his vantage point as a former assistant attorney general the way corporations had used this claim of corporate rights under the Constitution to strike down a series of public interest laws, including laws passed here in Massachusetts, making the argument that they had corporate speech rights that were being violated. And I had gotten in contact with Jeff through Carolyn Oppenheim, who many of you may know, and Ward Morehouse, who has now sadly passed away. Carolyn and Ward are the co-founders of the Western Massachusetts Committee on Corporations and Democracy. Ward had been a long-time leader on this question of challenging corporate personhood, a co-founder of POCLAD, Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. And they had been contacted by Jeff because Jeff was looking for groups that would sign on to this brief, and they asked me whether I would read over what he planned to sign and give them the advice whether they should join the brief. And of course, I was thrilled to see that this brief was being produced. It was the only one to make that direct frontal argument to the corporate rights claim. And then I quickly got in contact with Jeff through them. They held a forum in Northampton in September 2009. And we got together to start Free Speech for People, this national campaign prepared to make clear that the Supreme Court would not have the final say in Citizens United, that we the people would have the final say. And if it was going to go over the cliff, we would launch immediately a campaign for a 28th Amendment to the Constitution, overturn the ruling, and make clear that corporations are not people with constitutional rights. And that's just what we did. Moments after the court issued its ruling, we were prepared to go, and we launched this campaign on that day. Now, how did we get to the point where the court enunciated this claim that corporations would now have the right to spend unlimited general treasury dollars in our campaign? Well, we know the story of Citizens United and the case and how it came, but we also have to go back to really a memorandum written by Lewis Powell, a private attorney then working in 1971 for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who had been commissioned to write a memorandum on how the Chamber and corporate America could respond to the growing number of public interest laws that were getting passed during that era to protect the environment, to protect health care, consumer rights, civil rights. Because this ruling, to be clear, out of Citizens United, is not only a campaign finance ruling, as important as it is from that standpoint. It is also a corporate rights ruling, the most extreme extension of a corporate rights doctrine that has eroded our First Amendment and our Constitution for the past 30 years. And for that, we have to go back to this Powell memorandum. And in this memorandum, Lewis Powell articulated for the first time how corporations could go into court and make the claim that they had speech rights, that these artificial entities have corporate speech rights that can be used to strike down these public interest laws. Now, to be clear, we have recognized through the courts, wrongly in our view, this idea of corporations being treated as people dating back to an 1886 ruling, Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad, a railroad taxation case, in which the Supreme Court did not state in the case itself that corporations were people for the purposes of due process violations, but rather in the head notes. Head notes are what are written to summarize the case by then the clerks of the court, but also by others who would write up the summary of the case. And the clerk of the court at that time happened to be a former railroad executive, and he had basically heard a conversation that was happening with the Chief Justice saying that we're not going to decide the question around whether corporations are treated as people because we recognize that they are for purposes of due process violations. Well, it wasn't in the text of the ruling, but he went ahead and put in the head notes, and there you had this error being repeated in subsequent cases. But by the time of the New Deal era, this idea of corporate rights under the Constitution had become dormant, and it got resurrected by Lewis Powell and this Powell memorandum. And of course, Lewis Powell then became Justice Lewis Powell, nominated by then President Nixon and confirmed by the Senate, appointed to the court. And he became an architect of this doctrine of corporate speech rights. And one of the first cases that was brought before the court with this argument came out of Massachusetts. First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti was a case in 1978 that the Supreme Court decided, in which the First National Bank of Boston and other corporate entities argued that a ballot initiative that had been passed by the voters here in Massachusetts, which barred corporate money in the ballot initiative process, that was unconstitutional on corporate speech grounds. That the First National Bank of Boston had a speech right to be heard in the ballot initiative process. And they won. The Supreme Court upheld, or rather struck down the ballot initiative that the voters had passed, and went with the argument of these corporate entities, to the objection, it should be noted, of justices like Justice William Rehnquist, who became an early and strong dissenter on this ground. So I think it's critical to note that this is not a left-right divide. This is not a question of those on the progressive side viewing it one way and those on the conservative side viewing it another way. There is, in fact, a number of voices from the conservative Republican side who object to the idea of corporations being treated as people. And William Rehnquist was one of the leading voices in these cases, but even Justice Stevens, as we know, issued a 90-page dissent in the Citizens United ruling on behalf of the 4 dissenters. He was a Republican justice appointed by nominated by President Ford, confirmed by the Senate, and he had a strong opposition to the notion that corporations should be able to be treated as people with these political speech rights. But Lewis Powell nonetheless won the day in many of these early corporate speech cases, and it became a vehicle, a very effective one, for corporations to strike down a variety of public interest laws in all of these areas I have cited: environmental area, the healthcare field, consumer rights, civil rights, and now campaign finance. But just to give you a sense on the road to Citizens United of how much of a threat this is to American self-government, we have to look at a case that came out of Vermont in the 1990s. Vermont sought to do something about the bovine growth hormone drug that had been developed by Monsanto. As many of you may know, this is a drug that had been barred by the time it came into the United States all throughout the world. Australia banned it altogether. Europe banned it altogether. Canada banned it altogether. But because the Federal Drug Administration had become such a captive to industry, it was fast-tracked for use in the United States. It had been seen as a drug that had serious health effects with respect to both animals and humans, but nevertheless there was available for use in dairies around the country. So what did Vermont seek to do? Well, initially Dexter Randall, and Jeff Clements, I should say, writes about this in his book, Corporations Are Not People, which I highly recommend. And Dexter Randall, an organic dairy farmer in Vermont, sought to stop the FDA from fast-tracking it. When he lost that fight, he organized other organic dairy farmers and other Vermont citizens to get their citizen legislature to pass a law that made it clear that there would be a labeling requirement in all milk production in Vermont, so that people could make a choice whether or not to purchase milk coming from a dairy using this Monsanto drug, or whether to purchase milk from an organic dairy that wasn't using the drug. That was their law that they got passed. That was the basic requirement, a public notice, really, for public health care requirement. And what did the companies do, Monsanto and the Industrial Dairy Association? Well, they used the Powell speech doctrine. They went into court, in the federal court, sued the state of Vermont. And they said, we have a corporate speech right here. Now, you might say, well, what's the speech right? You know, they're not being, they're not being prevented from saying anything. Well, they made the argument that their speech right extends to the right not to speak. And so therefore the government can't force them to put these labels on their products, because they're people too, and they should not have to put these labels on their products. And they won. They got to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they won, and the Vermont law was struck down. We cannot, in this country today, because of this doctrine, because of that ruling, label milk products that use the Monsanto drug. People do not have that public information. So now we've taken the First Amendment and turned it on its head. It's not being used to protect people, natural persons, whether or not we have the right to speak or not be forced to speak by the government. And it's being used by these artificial entities, these corporate entities, to strike down public interest laws designed to protect we, the people. That's the danger of this doctrine, and that's why when we think of Citizens United, we have to really think of two problems. two problems emanating from that ruling and related rulings. One is the problem of unlimited campaign spending, the system that we have today that allows billionaires and now corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money in our elections, drowning out the voices of ordinary citizens, a direct threat to our elections, and made exponentially worse by Citizens United because of the amount of corporate money that now can come into our elections. But it also, the other problem, it also is a case that deals with this idea of corporate rights, this fabricated doctrine of corporate rights that must be overturned as well. And so the amendment movement that has been pushed forward by Free Speech for People and other allies in the field, Move to Amend, Common Cause, Public Citizen, People for the American Way, includes this argument that we have to have an amendment that not only goes after the problem of unlimited campaign spending, but also the problem of corporate rights. You know, our framers understood that corporations were not people. James Madison spoke of corporations as, quote, a necessary evil subject to proper limitations and guards. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, he hoped to crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations. And for two centuries, the United States Supreme Court and the federal courts followed the framers' mandate. There was no such thing as corporate speech until the Powell Doctrine emerged. And Stevens and Rehnquist and others highlighted this point. Corporations are not people. They do not breathe. They do not think. They do not have a conscience. In fact, they have state-based advantages that you and I do not have. Limited liability, perpetual life, the ability to aggregate wealth and distribute wealth. And on the nonprofit side, tax deductibility. For all those reasons, the framers understood that they should not be treated as people. And now we have this situation where even, you know, if we take just the Fortune 100 companies, they alone in 2008 made $600 billion in just that year. $600 billion. Now, in 2008, the total amount of money spent by the Obama campaign, the McCain campaign, the political parties, the PACs, all the congressional campaigns combined, all that money combined was $5 billion approximately. Huge sum of money, a problem that clearly predated Citizens United. But imagine that if just 2% of the Fortune 100 companies, 2% rather of their profits, have been spent in the 2008 elections, 2% out of $600 billion, they would have more than doubled all the amount of money spent by the presidential campaigns, congressional campaigns, PACs, and parties combined. That's the threat that Citizens United now poses from the campaign finance standpoint. And it goes even beyond the actual spending of these dollars. It goes to the direct threat on our public debate. Because every elected official and every candidate at every level in this country running for office knows that if they go after a corporate interest on behalf of the public interest, they may be subjected to an independent corporate expenditure. Congresswoman Donna Edwards was one of the first members of Congress to stand up and press for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. We had a conversation within hours after the Citizens United ruling, and she wanted to rush to the floor that day with her amendment language and wanted the language, you know, to be worked on with us, and we were proud to work with her. I bartered for a few more days from her to get the language that she wanted, but she was one of the first to come out of the box on this, and she has talked openly about the fact this threat is felt with every member of Congress now, that they know they can be targeted, and that that's going to stifle our debate on the critical questions of the day. And we're going to have now even narrower discussion on the solutions that need to be advanced for our country on these questions. So this is, I think, a threat that is unseen as well as felt even when we watch the television in the leading days up to the election. Now, you know, I know people will say, well, an amendment fight is a long-term fight, and we don't see how that could happen. Maybe not in this room, but maybe your friends and your neighbors might say that if you talk to them about this question. You know, first, we would argue that we have to look at our history on this point. We have done this before in our nation's history, 27 times before, 7 times to overturn egregious Supreme Court rulings. We have done it to defend our democracy, to expand our democracy. The 19th Amendment being a classic example of this that the League so importantly represents. And we have made enormous progress to date in this fight, just 2.5 years after the ruling. As I said, now 8 states are on record calling for a constitutional amendment, 6 of them doing so via passage of legislative resolutions. Massachusetts was one of the leading states. Hawaii did it first. A group of legislators did this within months after Citizens United, with no real campaign there in the state. We helped to initiate and lead a campaign in New Mexico that the League of Women Voters there and others joined, and New Mexico became the 2nd state. Other states include California, Vermont, Maryland, which has done it via a letter on behalf of a majority of legislators. They don't pass resolutions there, but they did it via a letter. Similarly, in Connecticut, via a letter. Rhode Island passed it through its legislature. There are, you know, a number of legislators as well who are looking at this for the coming sessions, including in Washington State, North Carolina, and elsewhere. And in Montana and Colorado, voters will have, for the first time, an opportunity to vote on this question at the ballot. Tens of thousands of voters have placed this on the ballot. We are part of a campaign with Common Cause in Montana, and we've endorsed a similar campaign that Common Cause and others has led in Colorado. And I think what we're going to see after this election is both Colorado and Montana overwhelmingly at the ballot box passing this measure and calling for an amendment. And if people have questions of whether this is only going to be a matter that appeals to those on the Democratic or progressive side, look to Montana to prove them wrong. There will be many Republicans and many independents voting for that ballot initiative. And then we've seen municipalities stand up. Of course, here in Massachusetts, Amherst and many other towns passed resolutions with members of the League helping advance those resolutions. And we've seen overall 300 plus municipalities across the country, including major cities like Seattle, New York, Los Angeles, and Boston, all calling for an amendment. 11 state attorneys general, led by Massachusetts Attorney General Martha Copley, whom we enlisted in this fight, have called for an amendment. We have joined with the American Sustainable Business Council in an effort to build support with the business community. Now 2,000 plus business leaders on board calling for an amendment. And this is a critical point that I want to make clearly. This is not an anti-corporate campaign. We recognize that corporations have a role in our economy, that they are economic actors, that we charter them as people in all the states. They don't have a right to exist, they have a privilege to exist, but when we charter them, they're supposed to engage in the business that they claim to engage in. But they are not. They are not political actors, and that's the critical point, and that's why so many of these business leaders are coming on board. Now, it may be tougher to get these Fortune 100 business leaders who benefit so directly from Citizens United, but many, many small business leaders are coming on board with this fight. One of our newest initiatives is with the Ben & Jerry's ice cream company. As many of you know, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield are leaders on this question of getting money out of politics, and they've started an initiative with us and the American Sustainable Business Council called Get the Dough Out. And Stephen Colbert has a flavor, Americone Dream, which is going to have new labels on the flavor. And this month, I believe, they're going to come out with labels to advertise the Get the Dough Out campaign. Stephen Colbert has come out with a statement saying he doesn't want any of this to go to this treasonous cause, as he put it. But we are going to use that as another platform to make the case that we need this amendment. We've also seen, it's important to note, a number of members of Congress come out for this. Now, you know, to be clear, we're building this from the grassroots with all the groups I mentioned and others. But it's been very gratifying to see those in Congress come out so strongly already for this amendment. Congressman McGovern, Jim McGovern, who is of course running in now this district in this election, is the lead sponsor of the People's Rights Amendment, which is an amendment that we've helped author that would overturn the corporate rights doctrine. Senator Udall is the lead sponsor of an amendment to overturn Buckley v. Vallejo, the 1976 ruling that equated money with speech and set us on this course of unlimited campaign spending. We've strongly endorsed that amendment, and as I said before, there are two problems coming out of Citizens United. We believe both those amendments are needed to address the problems. There are others. There's about a dozen amendment bills out there. And the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee has already held one hearing on these amendment proposals and plans to hold many others. And then just last month, the President of the United States made, for the first time, a statement calling for a constitutional amendment, joining this movement. And we hope that there will be a question or more asked this Wednesday night at the first presidential debate. We've launched an effort with a number of other groups, Unpack.org, Avaz, which is an online organizing site, and Demos. And we've called on Jim Lair, the PBS journalist who's going to be moderating Wednesday night's debate, to ask the question of both the candidates, where they stand on the question of Citizens United, where they stand on this idea of corporate constitutional rights, and whether or not they support an amendment and what they would do to advance it. We're pleased to see the President stand up for an amendment, but we want to know more. We want to know what he's going to do to fight for this critical question of our time. So we're going to engage in pushing this movement forward, and we very much hope that the League of Women Voters will continue in its work to advance this and to continue to press the National League to take this stand. And the questions that are on the ballot for all of us to vote on in a number of these districts are opportunities to push this forward. Now, it is true, for those who have raised this before, that the question on the ballot asks whether we should call on our state legislator to pass a resolution calling for an amendment. Well, we've already done that, right? So people ask, well, why should we vote for that? Well, the fact is that first, the gathering of the signatures for these ballot questions was done before the resolution passed the legislature. And second, the state law here does not allow for these local ballot questions to be directed to anyone else other than the state legislators. So you can't direct it to members of Congress. But nevertheless, it will be an important way to further measure popular support for the constitutional amendment that we all so desperately need. And that's why we are supporting these ballot questions that are being led by Common Cause here in Massachusetts, as well as Move to Amend. There will be other opportunities for us to raise these questions. We urge people to join us at freespeechforpeople.org. There's opportunities to sign up at the back if you haven't already joined us and you want to get updates on our work in this campaign. We're engaging in new outreach to religious leaders because we think there's a key argument that needs to be advanced that corporations have no soul and therefore they shouldn't be treated as people. And we're doing that with Auburn Seminary, which is a very well-respected religious institution in New York. And we're going to also fight on the front of pushing forward in the courts against the corporate rights doctrine. So through legal advocacy that we've already done in Montana with a case that emerged out of there, as well as other opportunities where we can file amici briefs and make the argument that corporations should not be treated as people. You know, what's really at stake here is a power struggle. It's a power struggle between whether it's corporations or people who shall govern in America. And we now see, at this moment in history, how unchecked corporate power is subverting our government and our democracy. The Wall Street crisis that led to the economic situation we're in today is a prime example of unchecked corporate power subverting our democracy and our government, taking hold of basic agencies, federal agencies that should have been regulating Wall Street, and in turn, instead allowing Wall Street to go the direction of the Wild West. BP oil catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico, unchecked corporate power subverting our government and our democracy. The Massey Energy Company and its coal mining disaster in West Virginia, killing 29 coal miners. An example of unchecked corporate power subverting our democracy and our government. We've actually launched a campaign with Appalachian Voices and Rainforest Action Network to de-charter the Massey Energy Company, to revoke its charter because of its long history, not just with that outrageous and terrible disaster in West Virginia, but with over a decade of 60,000 plus violations of federal and state law. And, you know, the fact is, as I said before, these charters are privileges, they're not rights, and in every charter law, corporate charter law in the country, there is a provision for revoking that charter when a company has abused its charter. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's endorsed this initiative and joined us in this fight to de-charter Massey Energy, says that Massey Energy is a criminal enterprise that cannot conduct its business without violating the law. And there's no better example, he's gone on to say, of an example of a company that should have its charter revoked. So we've engaged in that fight as well. But all these examples of unchecked corporate power subverting our democracy lead us to this point where we must engage in this fight for a 28th Amendment to the Constitution to make clear that corporations are not people and to reclaim our democracy. Now, if all that I've said tonight has not yet convinced you that we need to engage in this struggle of our time, then I'd like to just close with this story that many of you, I think, know, and if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me tell it, which is the story of Doris Haddock, otherwise known as Granny D. As many of you may remember, at the age of 89, she decided to walk across the country to overhaul our nation's campaign finance system. She set out from California, walking 10 miles a day. And by the way, you know, I should say that her family did not think this was a very wise thing to do. They pressed her, they urged her not to do this. When she said she was going to do it, they said, well, you have to at least practice in New Hampshire where she lived. So she began to walk 10 miles, you know, at different times in New Hampshire. And they said, well, you're going to have to walk through the snow in order to do this cross-country trip. So walk in the snow in New Hampshire. So she walked 10 miles in the snow in New Hampshire. She practiced, and she was ready to go. And despite their objections, she got out to California and started her trek across the country, walking 10 miles a day. She didn't have a grand plan as to how she was going to do this, how she was going to be housed, how she was going to be fed. She knew the general direction she was supposed to go, but she didn't know about these other details. She just started to walk. She just started to walk. And random strangers came out of their homes. They housed her. They fed her. They walked with her for part of the way. She walked through the rain, through the wind, through the snow. She cross-country skied in places. 14 months later, 3,200 miles later, turning 90 in the process, she reached Washington, D.C. to be greeted by then Senator Russ Feingold and Senator John McCain and hundreds of others there that day. And I was honored to have been among those greeting her that day, and I was honored to have known her and to have worked with her. And she passed away in March of 2010 at the age of 100, 2 months after the Citizens United ruling. And by the way, when she heard about the Citizens United ruling, she thought about walking across the country again. But when she passed away, I thought about the fact that when she was born, the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote, had yet to be enacted. She saw in her lifetime 9 amendments, passed by 2/3 of the Congress, ratified by 3/4 of the states. She is an example that change can happen in a lifetime, including a constitutional amendment. In the name of Granny D, it is time for a 28th Amendment to the Constitution to lift up that promise of American democracy and make it clear that we the people, not we the corporations, rule in America. Thank you very much. Yes, there in the back. Mary. Okay.
Yes, I am in favor of public financing of elections.
Yes.
And really don't think that anything short of that can help our political process to get the money out. So can you talk a little bit about, obviously yours is a bigger campaign.
Yes.
Are you working on public financing of campaigns?
Well, we fully support public funding elections, and as some of you know, I've worked Alice Swift, who's here, as a former client of mine, in a case that we brought defending the Massachusetts Clean Elections Law that many of you may remember voters passed in 1998, overwhelmingly at the ballot box, and then a certain Speaker of the House named Tom Finneran, who's now an ex-felon. At the time, he was Speaker of the House. He had an ironclad hold on the House, and he refused to let it be funded. And Alice and others sued the state. I was honored to represent them in challenging that decision by Tom Finneran not to, and the others in the legislature, not to fund the law. And we ultimately got a state Supreme Court ruling that required the funding of the law, and Finneran decided, well, we're not going to obey the ruling. So we went back into the courtroom, and the justices said, well, then go ahead and execute on state property, meaning seize state property and sell it in order to finance the candidates who were participating. Warren Tolman happened to be one of them. Jill Stein was another candidate applying for the funds, and others. So that was actually a major fight we had here in Massachusetts, and despite the fact that ultimately we won that ruling and got the financing for the candidates, the Finneran used it as a way to repeal the overall law, and we don't have public funding in this state. So I'm a strong proponent of bringing back that idea, putting it back on the ballot if it's not going to pass through the legislature, and let's bring it at the state level, and then let's also have it at the federal level. We do have a number of states, as you know, that have public funding elections, including nearby Connecticut, Vermont, Maine, Arizona, all of which have shown that people will run for office who never would have run before because of public funds. Here's the catch, though, Mary, with respect to public funding in the post-Citizens United landscape. We need public funding elections, but the reason why we need it coupled with an amendment is because after Citizens United, we cannot alone depend on public funding to level the playing field. Publicly financed candidates will be out there, and it'll be great to have them engaged in participating in the process, particularly those who never would have run before. But as I said before, any candidate, whether they're publicly financed or privately financed, can now be targeted with an independent corporate expenditure campaign that will overwhelm any public financing system. So the reason why it has to be coupled is it will effectively undermine any public funding system now to have this current system of a limited corporate spending. But yes, we support public funding. We support greater transparency, disclosure, which I know the League at the national level has pushed for. We have no disclosure laws now with respect to corporate spending, so much of this is being now done in secret. We support shareholder accountability laws that are essentially to require shareholder votes when the corporate management wants to spend this kind of money. We see the amendment fight as the engine for all of these reforms, because ultimately amendment fights are opportunities to return to that first principle type question. In this case, what are we as a nation? Is it we the people or we the corporations? And when we return to that first principle, we bring many more people along, and we are bold to the American people as to what the overarching frame of this fight must be. So we need to advance these legislative fights, but we also have to bring forward the amendment process that we have the power to engage in under Article 5 of the Constitution. Yes, let's hear it.
Yeah, it seems to me, listening to what you have to say, that corporate money spent for lobbying purposes is equally pernicious. Is there any way to tie that in with the 28th Amendment?
Yeah, so to be clear, our amendment that Congressman McGovern has introduced, did everybody hear this question, or do I need to repeat it? Okay, I'll repeat it. So the question is, it seems that what I've talked about ties corporate lobbying into the question as well, and is there anything that the amendment does to address the corporate lobbying side? And, you know, our amendment that Congressman McGovern has introduced would make clear that Congress and the states have the power, we the people, through our representatives in state legislatures and in Congress, to regulate corporate activity, that they are not natural persons. Now, it doesn't specify, you know, what those regulations should be. It simply states that there's this basic principle that the claim of corporate constitutional rights would no longer exist. And so if Congress wanted to say that corporate lobbying is hereby no longer allowed, they would have the power to do that because they're artificial entities, they're not people, and they don't have necessarily the right to do any of this. Now, some might say, well, wait a minute, you know, we're gonna undermine the ability of people to lobby. No. In fact, people still have the right to lobby. But if you want to organize as a state-based entity, a corporation, you're no longer a person or an unincorporated association of people. You are something very different, and therefore you can be regulated that way. And just, you know, just further to answer the concern that sometimes gets raised, people on the side who are opposing this say, well, this amendment is going to enable the government to shut down Planned Parenthood, shut down the ACLU, and I've heard it, frankly, even within the league, shut down the league. You know, this is just not true with respect to the jurisprudence, okay? The fact is that our rights as individuals, my right as a member of the league, is protected under the First Amendment and under the right of association as well.
As a follow-up, why is that a non-profit corporation or entity different from a for-profit?
Well, so the question is, why is a non-profit corporation different than a for-profit? And I appreciate the question. So our position is it's not, right? So the point is that some are trying to argue here that we have to carve out, and Senator Bernie Sanders, his amendment bill has this, a carve out for non-profit entities, that we're going to treat for-profit entities differently than non-profits. For-profits will no longer have constitutional rights, but non-profit corporate entities still will. And our point, you know, is, and Jeff has written about this in his book, and we've advanced this argument very clearly at Free Speech for People, that the individual rights associated with a non-profit are fully maintained and protected. So if, for example, the government tried to shut down the League of Women Voters, then all of us in this room as members of the league could go into court. The league could even represent us, have counsel, provide the resources to represent us, but the rights that are at stake before the court are our individual rights as human beings, as natural persons under the First Amendment, not the rights of the artificial entity. We do not need a non-profit corporation to have rights in order to protect our individual rights. We can have individual rights be advanced ourselves, and that's the critical point. And this idea that Lewis Powell has injected with his colleagues into the First Amendment is wholly antithetical to what the framers intended. The First Amendment is designed for natural persons, not for these artificial entities. The final point I would just make about this is when you have that carve out, then there's a huge loophole that makes this kind of amendment completely ineffective. Citizens United is a non-profit corporation. All of the secret money that's coming through, primarily coming through in our cycle, is going through non-profit entities. For-profit corporations, big oil companies, agribusiness, they're funneling it through non-profit entities. So we cannot make this false distinction. We have to treat them all the same, and that will be, in fact, a more of a transpartisan approach as well. One more question. Yes, in the back here. Yes.
Well, yeah, just to follow up, I still don't quite understand. So what about, say, common cause?
Yes.
To speak out on an issue affecting, let us say, the way Congress works or something.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, what right do they have then that's different from?
None.
Well, so Common Cause, again, is a corporation.
Yeah,
It has members.
yeah.
When it quote unquote speaks, it's not actually speaking as a corporation. The individual members are having their voices heard through Common Cause. So the point is, we don't need a corporate constitutional right to protect our individual rights. Our individual rights still exist as a part of Common Cause, part of the League, part of Planned Parenthood. The only place where a corporate constitutional right doesn't help or is needed is if it's Monsanto coming in and suing the state of Vermont, because Monsanto can't argue that it's somehow representing individual natural persons. It's representing this artificial entity that's claiming a speech right not to put the label on the product. But a nonprofit entity doesn't need a corporate constitutional right. It has individual members who have these constitutional rights that are fully protected. And that's the way it was before the Powell Doctrine. Again, for 200 years, we didn't have anything like a corporate speech right. And it's only this recent era in which we've seen this doctrine be used to strike down public interest laws. And they're not being used by nonprofit entities for the most part, although Citizens United certainly is a nonprofit entity, but they're being used by for-profit corporate America to advance the interests of the bottom line against the public interest. And that's the direct threat that we see from Citizens United and related rulings. Thank you very, very much for your time.
So thank you, John. We would like to show our appreciation through a mug.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
So that you can remember us over your morning cereal. I would also like to thank Amherst Media for taping this event and providing it for public viewing in the future.